Yes, I am a streamer. Yes, I did try to do my introduction while muted. The ads aren't quite over yet, so I will not be seen doing the goofy stuff. Oh, already a cat on my foot. No, that happens. Under flies. Let's see. Transski Airlines was... Yes. There's a 20-pound cat laying on my foot right now. He's 11 years old, and he's laying on my foot. Well, at least I can't move that foot. Unless I move it enough to irritate him. But anyway. It's Friday. That means it's time for fairy tales. And I hope everyone had a great week. And if not a great week, I hope you have a slightly better weekend. It's been really hot here. I think we got up to 103 today, which I could run without. I did do some book hunting, and I found a book that I'm definitely going to have to restore. Or at least I'm going to remake it, because it was stories for teeny wee, and it is actually falling apart and slightly molded, so I'm probably going to have to retype that one and go through and rebind it. But I'd hate for that kind of book to just be lost. And really looking through it, it looks like it's all done in 20-point font. But wouldn't be my first time to retype a story. But, you know, I like to make sure that these books continue, and I'm not really sure this one would be reprinted or anything. So I'll have to just make it myself. And add it to my ever-growing library. What else did I find? What was that? Did I change music? Huh. But I ended up getting 3 books from a estate sale set. I think 2 of them were actually on writing. Well, that's what made me wonder. I don't know anyone who would be using saw blades right now. I don't have any construction going on in my area. Both of the fans on my desk are turned off. I don't have any background videos going right now. Let me make sure just in case. It's muted. I don't think I have any other ads running. Doesn't look like it. Not everything is muted. That's weird. I don't know. I get random sounds. Ow! Ow. I just hit my headphone and it was really rather loud to me. Let's see. Well, yeah, and I finally got my author copies of book 2 in, so I'm kind of happy about that. Which means I can start doing the autographed copies on eBay if and when I get everything else set up. But book 2 is out, and eventually I'm sure Kel will pop up ads about it. Looks like she's already done the ad for book 1. Do I not have... My modes aren't falling on YouTube Studio. What's going on with that? Break the fourth wall here real quick. What's going on? Twitch settings, activity, how it's connected. Okay. Why are my emotes not falling? Come on, dropper. Got it turned on. Huh. That's weird. Oh well. Normally I'd just have the emotes falling on my head every time they're posted. I'm not seeing any of them. Weird. But anyway, congrats on getting first. Try one more time to see if it's doing it. No. I'm not seeing that one fall. Oh, there it is. There's the advertisement for book 2. I haven't sold a single copy of it yet. But, you know, they'll sell when they sell. I think it might just be because I keep VTube Studio cropped out so much that it doesn't show anything on it. Let's see if I can do anything with that. Okay, VTube Studio. Oh, expand it. Nope. I don't want it. Okay, I don't have this cropped at all. I'm just really toward the top of it. So, I don't know. There's Kel tweeting stuff again. Now, big is if I decide to go over to my chibi. Where is it? Dun, dun, dun. Where is it? Chibi-size me. There we go. Because my chibi is big. Oh, well, normally. Most of the time when I switch it over, it takes it to full screen. Why is my... Okay, well, it's working anyway. Let's see, where's my hat? I need my hat. There's my chibi topper. There we go. Just because I need a hat. Come on, where's my hat? Why is it not working? It says it's supposed to be on. Oh, there it is. Never mind. Yes, I get my hat. Because everyone needs a top hat occasionally. And I had to do the tilt just so it would just be on one ear. Dang, Kel, advertising the book. Oh, wait, that's the... Well, when I do the detective stories, I'm typically doing the Deer Hunter cap. But I thought, no, I was reading the Christmas Carol, and I thought I'd go ahead and get myself a top hat, too. And I thought I'd just make the top hat a redeem. Kel is just flooding my chat. Anyway, let's see if I can get over to the library in this size. I can't see. I'm a little short. The timer on the hat is supposed to be 30 seconds. The timer on the chibi form is 5 minutes, I believe. Let's see. Yep. Yeah, I've still got another 2.5 minutes left on the chibi model. The timer, I think it's set to 5 minutes, but I've got a lot of different ads running on her, so I'll lengthen those a little. It's supposed to be every 10 minutes. Change that to this 20. Okay. The book ad shouldn't show up until every 20 minutes now. I really should get into reading. It is that time. I just have to keep an eye for when my chibi pops back over to the other room. Let's get it so we can see the chat. But anyway, we are in the Yellow Fairy book now. Have been for a while. This is, I think we're a little over the third of the way through the book. And the first story we have for tonight is Polish. Interesting. I have not learned Polish yet. I'm in the process of learning German, so it'll be interesting when I can get it down. But our first story for this wonderful Friday night of fairy tales is The Crow. Once upon a time, there were 3 princesses who were all, 3 young and beautiful. But the youngest, although not actually the fairer, or any fairer than the other 2, I'm small, was the most lovable of them all. About half a mile from the palace in which they lived, there stood a castle, which was uninhabited and almost a ruin, but the garden which surrounded it was a mass of blooming flowers, and in the garden the youngest princess used to often walk. One day, when she was pacing to and fro under the lime trees, a black crow hopped out of a rose bush in front of her. The poor beast was all torn and bleeding, and the kind princess was quite unhappy about it. When the crow saw this, it turned to her and said, I'm not really a black crow, but an enchanted prince, who has been doomed to spend his youth in misery. If you only liked, princess, you could save me, but you would have to say goodbye to all your own people and come and be my constant companion in this ruined castle. There is one habitable room in it, in which there's a golden bed. There you'll have to live all by yourself, and don't forget that whatever you may see or hear in the night, you must not scream, for it will give you such a single cry, my sufferings will be doubled. The good-natured princess at once left her home, and her family was hurried to the ruined castle, and took possession of the room with the golden bed. When night approached, she lay down, but though she shut her eyes tight, sleep would not come. At midnight, she heard to her great horror someone coming along the passage, and in a minute her door was flung wide open, and a troop of strange beings entered the room. They at once proceeded to light a fire in the huge fireplace. Then they placed a great cauldron of boiling water on it. When they had done this, they approached the bed on which the trembling girl lay, and screaming and yelling all the time, They dragged her towards the cauldron. She nearly died of fright, but never uttered a sound. Then all of a sudden the cock crowed, and all the evil spirits had vanished. At the same moment, the crow appeared and hopped all around the room with joy. It thanked the princess most heartily for her goodness, and said that its sufferings had already been greatly lessened. Now one of the princess's elder sisters, who was very inquisitive, had found out about everything and went to pay her youngest sister a visit in the ruined castle. She implored her so urgently to let her spend the night with her in the golden bed that at last the good-natured princess consented. But at midnight, when the odd folk appeared, the elder sister screamed with terror, and from the time on the youngest princess insisted always on keeping her watch alone. So she lived in solitude all the daytime, and at night she would have been frightened had she not been so brave. But every day the crow came and thanked her for her endurance, and assured her that his sufferings were far less than they had been. And so, after 2 years passed away, when one day the crow came to the princess and said, "In another year I shall be freed from the spell I am under at present, because then the 7 years will be over. But before I can resume my natural form and take possession of the belongings of my forefathers, you must go out into the world and take service as a maidservant." The young princess consented at once, and for a whole year she served as a maid. But in spite of her youth and beauty, she was very badly treated and suffered many things. One evening, when she was spinning flax and had worked her little white hands, she heard a rustling beside her and a cry of joy. Then she saw a handsome youth standing beside her, who knelt down at her feet and kissed the little weary white hands. "I am the prince," he said, "who you are, goodness. When I wandered about in the shape of a black crow, freed from the most awful torments. Now come to my castle with me, and let us live there happily together." So they went to the castle, where they both had endured so much. But when they reached it, it was difficult to believe that it was the same one, for it had been rebuilt and done up again. And there they lived for 100 years, 100 years of joy and happiness. Okay, so princess suffered to help a prince. How often does that happen? Princess is suffering. Really? Anyway. Damn, these flies are horrible. Herb.
Yes, the crow got turned back into a prince. Isn't that nice for him?
Anyway, go back to being a bird. I don't know, would being a crow really be all that much torture? I mean, really. Collect shiny things, eat food. You're still smart and you can still talk. You know, it makes me wonder. If these stories had come out after the Americas had been discovered, would they have replaced all the crows with parrots? I mean, crows and ravens can talk. They just have to learn to mimic the voices. What would the stories have been like in South America if they had used parrots? Yes, ravens are indeed very smart. I've had a few friends that were ravens. In fact, when I was back in college, last century, I have to say last century because it was literally in the 1990s when I was in college. I was doing theater classes, and for some reason, I think anywhere from 15 to 20 ravens were circling outside the theater. And of course, everyone else was staying away, and me, being the person I am, I walked over there. I leaned against the wall and called one over to me. He came over, perched on my shoulder, and we had a chat. I thought it was funny because, chittering in my ear, no problem. It was cool. I walked into the building. All the other theater majors were like, okay, you're talking to birds now. And then the director came in and was yelling at me, which you really shouldn't do to someone who's talking to a raven. And I looked at her, looked at the raven, and pointed at her. The raven freaking attacked her. Oh, it just wanted her earrings, really. But they had me take the raven back outside. I would have taken the raven home with me. In fact, I did, and then graveyard birds aren't too bad. We did have a black dog at one of the graveyards here recently, and I would have gone to adopt it too. Because it was a beautiful long-haired dog. It looked like a husky, except it was black and just had a white face. I was thinking, okay, yes, I will gladly take in the hellhound. Because it was a beautiful dog, and it was well-mannered. It was just walking around the graves. It was actually comforting people there, and if you know anything about black dog lore and graveyards, it was there to guide people. Unlike a Chihuahua, who used to be a guide and just became an irritating little yappy beast. Anyway. If anyone ever gets my second book, I really kind of lay in Chihuahuas in it. In The Golden Children, I literally said that the witch's dog was a Chihuahua. Which, Chihuahuas wouldn't exist in the German forest, but I had to make it a Chihuahua just for the hell of it. Anyway, should continue with the stories. Man, what is with the flies tonight? Quick hydration. So our second wonderful story for this Friday night of fairy tales. That's one of those very descriptive titles of the story. How 6 men traveled through the wide world. There was once upon a time a man who understood all sorts of arts. And he rode a mini bike down the streets, apparently. He served in the war, and he bore himself bravely as well. But when the war was over, he got his discharge and set out on his travels with 3 farthings in his pocket for Faye. No, it was actually a kid on a mini bike. I was about to say, I recognize the sound. And they're like driving up in the street, and I don't really want to close the window because it's too freaking hot for me to close the window. Anyway, wait, he said, that does not please me. Only let me find the right people, and the king shall yet give me all the treasures of his kingdom. And he strode angrily into the forest, and there he saw a man standing who had uprooted 6 trees as if they were straw. He said to him, Will you be my servant and travel with me?
Yes, he said, but first of all, I will take this little bundle of sticks home to my mother.
And he took one of the trees and wound it around the other 5, and raised the bundle on his shoulders and bore it off. Then he came back and went with his new master, and who said, "We ought to take the travel around the wide world." And when they had gone a little way, they came upon a hunter, who was on his knees, his gun to his shoulder, aiming at something. And the master said to him, "Hunter, what are you aiming at?" He answered, 2 miles from this place, a fly sits on a branch of an oak. I want to shoot its eye out." "Oh, go with me," said the man. "If we 3 together, we shall easily travel through the wide world." The hunter agreed and went with him, and they came to 7 windmills whose sails were going around quite fast, and yet they did not see a breath of wind, nor a leaf moving. The man said, "I don't know who's turning those windmills, but there's not the slightest breeze blowing." So he walked on with his servants, and when they had gone 2 miles, they saw a man sitting on a tree, holding one of his nostrils and blowing out the other. "Fellow, what are you puffing at up there?" asked the man. He replied, 2 miles from this place are standing 7 windmills. See, I'm blowing to drive them around." "Oh, well, come with us," he said. "If we 4 are together, we shall easily travel through the wide world." So the blower got down and went with them. And after a time, they saw a man who was standing on one leg and had unstrapped the other and laid it near them. Then said the master, "You have made yourself very comfortable to rest."
I'm a runner, answered he, and so that I shall not go too quickly, I have unstrapped one leg, and when I run with 2 legs, I go faster than a bird flies.
"Come with us. If we 5 are together, we shall easily travel through the wide world." So he went with them, and not long afterward, met a man who wore a little hat, but it had it slouched over one ear. "Manners, manners," said the man to him. "Don't hang your hat over one ear. You look like a madman." "I dare not," said the other, "for if I were to put my hat on straight, there would come such a frost that the birds in the sky would freeze and all fall dead on the earth." And this is the origin of the X-Men. No, just kidding. "Oh, go with me," said the master. "If we 6 are together, we shall easily travel through the wide world." So now the 6 came to a town in which the king had proclaimed that whoever should run with his daughter in a race and win should become her husband. But if he lost, he must lose his head. This was reported to the man who declared he would compete. "But," he said, "I shall let my servant run for me." Well, the king replied, "Then both your heads must be staked, and your head and his must be guaranteed for the winner." When this was agreed upon and settled, the man strapped on the runner's other leg, saying to him, "Now be nimble and see that we win." It was arranged that whoever should first bring water out of the stream a long way off should be the victor. Then the runner got a pitcher, and the king's daughter another. And they began to run at the same time. But in a moment, when the king's daughter was only a little way off, no spectator could see the runner, and it seemed as if the wind had whistled past. In a short time he reached the stream and filled his pitcher with water, and had already turned around again. But halfway home, a great drowsiness came over him, and he put down the pitcher and lay down, and he fell asleep. He had, however, put on a horse's skull which was lying on the ground for his pillow, so that his head should not be too comfortable and wake up soon. In the meantime, the king's daughter, who could also run very well as an ordinary man could, reached the stream and hastened back with her pitcher full of water. When she saw the runner lying asleep, she was delighted and said, "My enemy has given into my hands." She emptied his pitcher and ran on. Everything now would have been lost if by the good luck the hunter had not been standing on the castle tower and had seen everything with his sharp eyes. "Ah," he said, "the king's daughter shall overreach us." And, loading his gun, he shot so cleverly that he shot away the horse's skull from under the runner's head without it hurting him. Then the runner awoke, jumped up, and saw that his pitcher was empty, and the king's daughter was far ahead. But he did not lose courage and ran back to the stream to refill his pitcher, and once again he was home 10 minutes before the king's daughter arrived. "Look," he said, "I have just exercised my legs. That was nothing of a run." But the king was angry, and his daughter even more so, and she should be carried away as a common discharged soldier. And they consulted together how they could destroy both him and his companions. "Then," said the king to her, "I have found a way. Don't be frightened. They shall not come home again," he said to them. "You must now make merry together, and eat and drink." And then he led them into a room which had a door of iron. The doors were also of iron, and the floor and the windows were barred with iron. In the room was a table spread with delicious food. The king said to them, "Go in and enjoy yourselves." And as soon as they were inside the doors were shut and bolted. Then he made the cooks come and ordered him to keep up a large fire under the room until the iron was red hot. The cook did so, and the 6 sitting around the table felt it grow very warm, and they thought that this was because of the good fare. But when the heat became still greater and they wanted to go out, they found the doors and windows fastened. Then they knew that the king meant them harm and was trying to suffocate them. "But he shall not succeed," cried he of the little hat. "I will make a frost come which shall make the fire ashamed and die out." So he put his hat on straight, and at once there came such a frost that all the heat disappeared and the food on the dishes even began to freeze. When a couple of hours had passed, the king thought they must be quite dead from the heat, and he had the doors opened and went in to see for himself. But when the doors were opened, there stood all 6 alive and well, saying that they were glad to come out to warm themselves, for the great cold in the room had frozen the food all hard on the dishes. Then the king went angrily to the cook and scolded him, and asked him why he had not done as he was told. But the cook answered,
There's heat enough there. See for yourself. Then the king saw a huge fire burning under the iron room, and understood that he could do no harm to the 6 in this way. The king now began to think how he could free himself from his unwelcome guests. He commanded the master come to them and said, "If you will take gold and give up your right to my daughter, you shall have as much as you like." "Ivy." "Oh, yes, your majesty," answered he. "Give me as much as my servant can carry, and I will give up your daughter." The king was delighted, and the man said, "I will come and fetch it in 14 days. And then he called all the tailors in the kingdom together and made them sit down for 14 days sewing at a sack. When it was finished, he made the strong man who had uprooted the trees take the sack on his shoulder and go with him to the king. The king then said, "What a powerful fellow that is, carrying a bale of linen as large as a house on his shoulder." And he was much frightened and thought, what a lot of gold he will take away with him. Then he got a ton of gold brought, and 16 of the strongest men had to carry it. But the strong man seized it with one hand, put it in the sack, and said, "Why don't you bring me some more? That scarcely covers the bottom." Then the king had to send away again and again to fetch his treasures, which the strong man shoved into a sack. But the sack was only half full. "Bring more," he cried. "These crumbs won't fit it." So 7,000 wagons of gold from the whole of the kingdom were driven up. These strong men shoved it into the sack, oxen and all. "I will no longer be particular," he said, "and will take what comes so that the sack shall be full." When everything was put in and there was not yet enough, he said, "I will make an end of this. It is easy to fasten a sack when it's not full." Then he threw it on his back and went on to his companions. Now, when the king saw how a single man was carrying away the wealth of the whole country, he was angry and made his cavalry mount and pursue the 6 and bring back the strong man with the sack. 2 regiments soon overtook them and called to them, "You are all prisoners. Lay down the sack of gold and we shall cut you down." "What did you say?" said the blower. "Are we prisoners? Before that, you shall dance in the air." And he held one nostril and blew with the other at the 2 regiments, and they were separated and blown away in the blue sky over the mountains, one this way and one that. The sergeant major cried for mercy, saying that he had 9 wounds and was a brave fellow and did not deserve this disgrace. So the blower led him off, and he came down without hurt. Then he said to him, "Now go home to the king and say that if he sends any more cavalry, I will blow them all up in the air as well." When the king received this message, he said, "Let the fellows go. They are bewitched." Then the 6 brought the treasure home and shared it among themselves and lived contentedly until the end of their days. He was plugging one nostril and blowing out the other one. I think that actually covered all the men in it.
Strong one. The hunter, the runner, the blower. 1, 2, 3. There's supposed to be 6 men. Did I miss one? Because there's the former military, strongman, the blower, the runner, the hunter. That's only 5. It's supposed to be a story about 6 men. Huh. Why does it feel like I missed something? There's a soldier, strongman, the hunter, the runner, and the blower. Oh, the hat. Right, okay. Anyway, I swear the bottle of blood orange wine that I drank before I did stream, it may have been a little strong. Because even though I made it maybe 2 months ago, it was still trying to ferment, even though I had it in the refrigerator. Yeah, I had gotten a lot of blood orange juice a while back, and I thought, I'm gonna make wine out of this, and I did. I posted the picture of it on Twitter, but it was still fermenting, even though I had it in the refrigerator. I should have killed the yeast, but apparently it didn't. So it was a bit stronger than the rest of the batch. It's still tasty though. My vision's not at all blurred. Oh yeah, brains do funny things. I don't know what a blit bug is. The next one, if I'm looking at the language correctly, looks like it was French. Yep, it is French. I don't know, I haven't really been keep track of Pokemon. Which is strange, I can't say that I've ever played any of the actual Pokemon computer games or Game Boy games. I've only ever played the card games, and I got my hands on a copy of Pokemon Uranium, which I know is not an official game, and I played it. It was weird. I have played Pokemon Go, but that's pretty much the only Pokemon game I've actually played. I used to be a gym leader for that card game. Well, it's been at least 2 decades since I did that. That was like early 2000. But I was one of the gym leaders for Pokemon League in a bookstore. I think I still have my stamp in my book somewhere. I still have the Team Rocket guidebook, because Team Rocket. Anyway, I should probably continue with stories. Let's see. The next one is French. That's interesting. I don't think I've read this particular fairy tale before, so it'll be an interesting one. Yes. I still have Giovanni's Persian. I can't remember which card series it came from, but it's one of the only cards I ever bothered sleeving. Just because, I don't know, I like the Persian. Anyway. Kel? You just... Well, that's my charity at least. I do a charity for one of the local wildlife rehabilitation centers, which is Wildlife Wildlife. I have actually gone out and helped with it. I've gotten to feed beasties. It's fun. I used to hang out with a cute little bobcat named Nala. I fed her too. I used to help clean their little trailer that they started at. They've expanded so much, and I'm really glad that they've finally gotten ownership of the property. Hang out with a couple of the coyotes they got out there that are... They're actually coy wolves. Luckily, they've got some red wolf in them. A couple of bobcats. The badgers are adorable. Right now, their main mascot is Cinder, who was a porcupine who was rescued from our massive wildfire we had last year. And they've been working with her, and she's become like one of their main icons on their t-shirts. So if you want to donate to them, I'm sure they'd appreciate it. With the way Twitch is doing it right now, I can't finish the donation until the donation goal is done. And honestly, I've taken at least $60 a year down to them just when I get a visit. I've contributed to their wish list on Amazon and everything else too. But yeah, that's a good charity cause in my area. And, you know, it helps wildlife. They help wildlife through the entire Texas Panhandle. They recently got some foxes that were down in the Dallas area that they had to rescue. So, I like wildlife charities. You gambled $10,000 on black, and now on lost still, and I'm losing your mind. Congratulations. You less than a 50-50 chance, and that's not really a good thing. But considering I'm doing good to have a few $100s, I don't think I could ever see myself gambling $10,000. And don't gamble at all if you don't have, if you're not enough to lose. Not so bad as when you're playing roulette. Black is in a 50-50 chance. Because, let's see, there's only two that aren't black or red. And they're both green. Now, if you ever bet on the greens and you win, well, you're set, but I don't know who's ever won on those. But yeah, don't gamble if you can't afford to lose. Easiest way to put it. But thank you for coming in. But anyway, back to fairy tales. And our next fairy tale for this fabulous Friday night. Ouch. The Wizard King. In very ancient times, there lived a king whose power lay not only in the vast extent of his dominions, but also in the magic secrets of which he was a master. After spending the greater part of his early youth in pleasure, he met a princess of such remarkable beauty that he at once asked her hand in marriage, and having obtained it, considered himself the happiest of all men. After a year's time, a son was born, worthy in every way of such distinguished parents, and much admired by the whole court. As soon as the queen thought him strong enough for a journey, she set him out with secretly to visit her fairy godmother. I said secretly, because the fairy had warned the queen that the king was a magician, and from time to time immemorial there had been a standing feud between the fairies and the wizards. He might not have approved of his wife's visits. The fairy godmother, who took the deepest interest in all the queen's concerns, and who had much pleased with the little prince, endowed him with the power of pleasing everybody from his cradle, as well with such a wonderful ease in learning everything which could help him make a perfectly accomplished prince. Accordingly, to the delight of his teachers, he made the most rapid progress in his education, consistently surpassing everyone's expectations. Before he was many years old, however, he had the sorrow of losing his mother, whose last words were to advise him to never undertake anything of importance without consulting the fairy under whose protection she had placed him. The prince's grief at the death of his mother was great, but it was nothing compared to that of the king, his father, who was quite inconsolable for the loss of his dear wife. Neither time nor reason seemed to lighten his sorrow, and the sight of all familiar faces and things about him only served to remind him of his loss. He therefore resolved to travel for change, and by means of magic art he was able to visit every country he came to see under different shapes, returning every few weeks to the place where he had left a few followers. Having traveled from land to land in this fashion without finding anything to rivet his attention, it occurred to him to take the form of an eagle, and in this shape he flew across many countries and arrived at length in a new and lovely spot where the air seemed filled with the scent of jessamine and orange flowers, which the ground was thickly planted. Attracted by the sweet perfume, he flew lower and perceived some large and beautiful gardens filled with 100 shapes. Each wide stem flowed through the garden, and on it floated richly ornamented barges and gondolas filled with people dressed in the most elegant manner and covered with jewels. In one of these barges sat the queen of that country with her only daughter, a maiden more beautiful than the day star, and attended by ladies of the court. No more exquisitely lovely mortal was ever seen than this princess, and it needed all an eagle's strength of sight to prevent the king from being hopelessly dazzled. He perched on top of a large orange tree, whence he was able to survey the scene and gaze at pleasure on the princess's charms. Now, an eagle with a king's heart in his breast is apt to be bold, and accordingly he instantly made up his mind to carry off the lovely damsel, feeling that, having once seen her, he could not live without her. He waited till he saw her in the act of stepping ashore, when suddenly swooping down, he carried her off before her equerry in attendance had advanced to offer her his hand. The princess, on finding herself in an eagle's talons, she uttered the utmost shrieks and cries, but her captor, though touched by her distress, would not abandon his lovely prey, and continued to fly through the air too fast to allow his saying anything to comfort her. At length, when he thought they had reached a safe distance, he began to lower his flight and gradually descended to earth, deposited his burden in a flowery meadow, and then entreated her pardon for his violence, and told her that he was about to carry her to a great kingdom over which he ruled, and where he desired she should rule with him, adding many tender and consoling expressions. Yes, I flew away because I want you to marry you, and, yeah, I'm a bird. For some time, the princess remained speechless, but recovering herself a little, she burst into a flood of tears. The king, much moved, said, "Adorable princess, dry your tears, I implore you. My only wish is to make you the happiest person in the world."
"If you speak truth, my lord," replied the princess, "restore me to the liberty you have deprived of me. Otherwise I can only look at you as my worst enemy."
The king retorted that her opposition filled him with despair, and that he hoped to carry her to a place where all around would respect her, and where every pleasure would surround her. So saying, he seized her once more, and in spite of all her cries, he rapidly bore her off to the neighborhood of his capital. Here he gently placed her on the lawn, and as he did so, she saw a magnificent palace spring up at her feet. The architecture was imposing, and in the interior the rooms were handsome and furnished in the best possible taste. The princess, who expected to be quite alone, was pleased at her finding herself surrounded by a number of pretty girls, all anxious to wait on her, whilst a brilliantly colored parrot said the most agreeable things in the world. There's the parrot. On arriving at this palace, the king had resumed his own form, and though he no longer young, he might have well pleased any other than this princess, but had been so prejudiced against him by his violence that she could only regard him with feelings of hatred, which she was at no pains to conceal. The king hoped, however, that time might not only soften her anger, but accustom her to his sight. He took the precaution of surrounding the palace with a dense cloud, and then hastened to his court, where his prolonged absence was causing much anxiety. The prince and all his courtiers were delighted to see their beloved king again, but they had to submit themselves to more frequent absences than ever on his part. He made a business of protesting for shutting himself up in a study, but it was really in order to spend time with the princess, who remained inflexible. Now, being able to imagine what could be the cause of so much obstinacy, the king began to fear lest, in spite of all his precautions, she might have heard of the charms of the prince, his son, whose goodness, youth, and beauty made him adored at the court. The idea made him horribly uneasy, and he resolved to remove the cause of his fears by sending the prince on his travels
escorted by a magnificent retainer. The prince, after visiting several courts, arrived at the one where the lost princess was still deeply mourned. The king and queen received him most graciously, with some festivities were revived to do him honor. One day, when the prince was visiting the queen in her own apartments, he was much struck by a most beautiful portrait. He eagerly inquired whose it was, and the queen, with many tears, told it was all that was left of her beloved daughter, who had suddenly been carried off. She knew neither where nor how. The prince was deeply moved, and vowed that he would search the world for the princess, and take no rest till he found her and restored her to her mother's arms. The queen assured him of her eternal gratitude and promised, should he succeed, to give him her daughter in marriage, together with all the estates she herself had owned. The prince, far more attracted by the thoughts of possessing a princess than her promised dower, set forth on his quest after taking leave of the king and queen, later giving him a miniature of her daughter, which he was in the habit of wearing. His first act was to seek the fairy under whose protection he had been placed, and he implored her to give him all the assistance of her art and counsel in this important matter. After listening attentively to the whole adventure, the fairy asked for some time to consult her books. After due consideration, she informed the prince that the object of his search was not far distant, but that it was too difficult for him to attempt to enter the enchanted palace where she was, as the king, his father, had surrounded it with a thick cloud, and that the only expedience she could think of was to gain the possession of the princess's parrot. This, she added, did not appear possible, as it often flew about some distance in the neighborhood. Having told the prince all this, the fairy went out in hopes of seeing the parrot, and soon returned with the bird in her hand. She promptly shut it up in a cage, and touching the prince with her wand, transformed him into an exactly similar parrot, after which she instructed him how to reach the princess. The prince reached the palace in safety, but was so dazzled at first by the princess's beauty, which, far surpasses expectations, that he was quite dumb for a time. The princess was surprised and anxious, fearing the parrot, who had been her greatest comfort, had fallen ill. She took him in her hand and caressed him. This soon reassured the prince, and encouraged him to play his part well, and he began to say 1,000 agreeable things which charmed the princess. Presently the king appeared, and the parrot noticed with joy how much he was disliked. As soon as the king left, the princess retired to her dressing room. The parrot flew after her, and overheard her lamentations at the continued persecutions of the king, who had pressed her to consent to their marriage. The parrot said so many clever and tender things to comfort her that she began to doubt whether this could indeed be her own parrot. When he saw her well disposed towards him, he exclaimed,
Madam, I have the most important secret to confide in you, and I beg you not to be alarmed by what I am about to say. I am here on the behalf of the Queen, your mother, with the object of delivering your highness, to prove which, behold this portrait which she gave me herself.
So saying, he drew forth a miniature from under his feathers. The princess's surprise was great, but after what she had seen and heard, it was impossible to indulge in hope, for she had recognized the likeness of herself, which her mother had always worn.
The parrot, finding she was not much alarmed, told her who he was, all that her mother had promised him, and the help he had already received from the fairy, who had assured him that she would give him means to transport the princess back to her mother's arms. When he found her listening attentively to him, he implored the princess to allow him to resume his natural shape. She did not speak, so he drew a feather from his wing, and she beheld before her a prince of such surpassing beauty that it was impossible to hope that she might owe her liberty to so charming a person. Meantime, the fairy had prepared a chariot, to which she harnessed 2 powerful eagles. Then, placing the cage with the parrot in it, she charged the bird to conduct it to the window of the princess's dressing room. This was done in a few minutes, and the princess, stepping into the chariot with her prince, was delighted to find her parrot again. As they rose through the air, the princess remarked a figure mounted on the eagle's back, flying in front of the chariot. She was rather alarmed, but the prince reassured her, telling her that it was the good fairy to whom she owed so much, and who was now conducting her in safety back to her mother. The same morning, the king woke suddenly from a troubled sleep. He had dreamt that the princess was being carried off from him, and transformed himself into an eagle. He flew from the palace. When he failed to find her, he flew into a terrible rage and hastened home to consult his books, by which means he discovered that it was his son who had deprived him of his precious treasure. Immediately he took the shape of a harpy, and filled with rage, was determined to devour his son, and even the princess too, if only he could overtake them. He set out at full speed, but started too late, and was further delayed by a strong wind, which the fairy had raised behind the young couple as to baffle any pursuit. You may imagine the rapture which the queen received her daughter that she had given up for lost, as well as the amiable prince who had rescued her. The fairy entered with them and warned the queen that the wizard king would arrive shortly, infuriated by his loss, and that nothing would preserve the prince and princess from his rage and magic, unless they were actually married. The queen hastened to inform the king, her husband, and the wedding took place on the spot. As the ceremony was completed, the wizard king arrived. His despair at being so late bewildered him so entirely that he appeared in his natural form and attempted to sprinkle some black liquid over the bride and bridegroom, which was intended to kill them. But the fairy stretched out her wand, and the liquid dropped onto the magician himself. He fell down senseless, and the princess's father, deeply offended by the cruel revenge which had been attempted, offered him to be removed and locked up in prison. Now, as magicians lose all their power as they are in prison, the king felt himself much embarrassed at thus being at the mercy of those he had greatly offended. The prince implored and obtained his father's pardon, and the prison doors were opened. No sooner was this done than the wizard king had been seen in the air under the form of some unknown bird as he flew off, that he would never forgive either his son or the fairy the cruel wrong they had done to him. Everyone entreated the fairy to settle in the kingdom where she was now, to which she consented. She built herself a magnificent palace to which she transported her books and fairy secrets, and where she enjoyed the sight of the perfect happiness she had helped to bestow on the entire royal family. You know, I had never heard anything about wizards losing their magic when they're put in jail. Good to know, I suppose. I would hate to lose my magic if I got incarcerated. Though, it's easier to do to fairies if you put them in an iron cell. Wizard jail! Honestly, I'd never heard of anything saying that a wizard loses his power if he's imprisoned. I mean, it would make sense. But it would have to be a particular kind of prison to separate them from, you know, whatever the source of their magic is. I mean, admittedly, mine is technically the imagination, which is really hard for me to be separated from. Excuse me. But yeah, wizard jail. Oh, wait. Oh. This next one looks like it's one of the ones my friends is named after. I mean, everyone should know Nixy, right? Nixies are pretty interesting people. So, our next wonderful fairy tale, or Nixy tale in this case, it's sermon, for this evening, the Nixy. There was once upon a time a miller who was very well off and had so much money and as many goods as he knew what to do with. But sorrow comes in the night, and the miller all of a sudden became so poor that at last he could hardly call the mill in which he sat his own. He wandered about all day full of despair and misery, and when he lay down at night, he could get no rest, but lay awake in the night, sunk in sorrowful thoughts. One morning he rose up before dawn and went outside, for he thought his heart would be lighter in the open air. He wandered up and down the banks of a mill pond. He heard rustling in the water, and when he looked, he saw a white woman rising up from the water. He realized at once this could be none other than the Nixy of the mill pond, and in his terror he didn't know if he should fly away or remain where he was. Well, he hesitated. The Nixy spoke, calling him by name, and asked why he was so sad. When the miller heard how friendly her tone was, he plucked up heart and told her how rich and prosperous he had been all his life, up until now, when he didn't know what he was to do for want and misery. Then the Nixy spoke comforting words to him, and promised that she would make him richer and more prosperous than he had ever been in his life before, if he would give her in return the youngest thing in his house. The miller thought she must mean one of the puppies or kittens, so promised the Nixy at once what she had asked, and returned to his mill full of hope. On the threshold he was greeted by a servant with the news that his wife had just given birth to a boy. The poor miller was horrified by these tidings, and went in to his wife with a heavy heart to tell her his relations of the fatal bargain he had just struck with the Nixy. "I would gladly give up all the good fortune she promised me," he said, "if I could only save my child." But no one could think of any advice to give him, beyond taking care that the child never went near the mill pond. So the boy thrived and grew big, and in the meantime all prospered for the miller, and in a few years he was richer than he had ever been before. But all the same, he could not forget his good fortune, for he could not forget his compact with the Nixy, and he soon knew that sooner or later she would demand his payment in full. But year after year went by, and the boy grew up and became a great hunter, and the lord of the land took him into his services, for he was as smart and bold a hunter as you could wish to see. In a short time he married a pretty young wife, and lived with her in great peace and happiness. One day, when he was out hunting, a hare sprang up at his feet, and ran some way in front of him to an open field. The hunter pursued it hotly for some time, and at last shot it dead. Then he proceeded to skin it, never noticing that he was close to the mill pond, which, since his childhood, he had not been taught to avoid. He soon finished the skinning and went to the water to wash the blood off his hands. He had hardly dipped them in the pond when the Nixy rose up in the water, seizing him in her wet arms, and she dragged him down with her under the waves. When the hunter did not come back home in the evening, his wife grew very anxious, and when his game bag was found so close to the mill pond, she guessed at once what had befallen him. She was nearly beside herself with grief, and roamed around and round the pond, calling on her husband without ceasing. At last, worn out with sorrow and fatigue, she fell asleep and dreamt that she was wandering along a flowery meadow, when she came to a hut where she found an old witch who promised to restore her husband to her. When she awoke the next morning, she determined to set out and find the witch. So she wandered on for many a day, and at last she reached the flowery meadow and found the hut where the old witch lived. The poor wife told her all that had happened, and how she had been told in a dream of the witch's power to help her. The witch consoled her to go to the pond the first time there was a full moon, and to comb her black hair with a golden comb, then to place the comb on the bank. The hunter's wife gave the witch a handsome present, thanked her heartily, and then returned home. Time dragged heavily till the time of the full moon, but it passed at last, and as soon as it rose, the young wife went to the pond, combed her black hair with a golden comb, and when she had finished, placed the comb on the bank. Then she watched the water impatiently. Soon she heard a rushing sound, and a big wave rose suddenly and swept the comb off the bank. And a minute later, the head of her husband rose from the pond and gazed sadly at her. But immediately another wave came, and the head sank back into the water without having said a word. The pond lay still and motionless, glittering in the moonshine, and the hunter's wife was not a bit better off than she had been before. In despair, she wandered about for days and nights, and at last, worn out by fatigue, she sank once more into a deep sleep, and dreamt exactly the same dream about the old witch. So, the next morning she went to the flowery meadow and sought the witch in her hut, and told her of her grief. The old woman counseled her to go to the mill pond on the next full moon and play on a golden flute, and then lay the flute on the bank. As soon as the next full moon, the hunter's wife went to the mill pond, played on a golden flute, and when she finished, placed it on the bank. Then a rushing sound was heard, and a wave swept the flute off the bank. And soon the head of the hunter appeared and rose up higher and higher until he was half out of the water. Then he gazed sadly at his wife and stretched out his arms towards her. But another rushing wave arose and dragged him under once more. The hunter's wife who stood on the bank, full of joy and hope, sank back in despair when she saw her husband snatched away before her eyes. But for her comfort, she dreamt the same dream a third time, and betook herself upon once more to the witches' huts in the flowery meadow. This time the old woman told her to go out the next full moon to the mill pond, and to spin there with a golden spinning wheel, and then to leave the spinning wheel on the bank. The hunter's wife did as she was advised, and the first night the moon was full, she sat and spun with a golden spinning wheel, and then left the wheel on the bank. In a few minutes, a rushing sound was heard in the waters, and the waves swept the spinning wheel from the bank. Immediately the head of her husband rose up from the pond, getting higher and higher each moment, till at length he stepped on the bank and fell upon his wife's neck. But the waters of the pond rose up suddenly, overflowed the bank where the couple stood, and dragged them under the flood. In her despair, the young wife called to the old witch to help her, and in a moment the hunter was turned into a frog, and the wife into a toad. But they were not able to remain together, for the water tore them apart, and when the flood was over, they both resumed their own shapes again. But the hunter and the hunter's wife found themselves each in a strange country, and neither knew what had become of the other. The hunter determined to become a shepherd, and his wife too became a shepherdess, and they herded the sheep for many years in solitude and sadness. Now it happened once that the shepherd came to a country where the shepherdess lived. The neighborhood pleased him, and he saw that the pasture was rich and suitable for his flocks. So he brought his sheep there and herded them as before. The shepherd and the shepherdess became great friends, but they did not recognize each other in the least. But one evening, when the moon was full, they sat together watching their flocks, and the shepherd played upon his flute. Then the shepherdess thought of that evening that she had sat in the full moon by the mill pond, and had played on the golden flute. The recollection was too much for her, and she burst into tears. The shepherd asked her why she was crying, and left her no peace until she told him all of her story. Then scales fell from the shepherd's eyes, and he recognized his wife, and she him. So they returned joyfully to their own home, and lived in peace and happiness ever after. Sorry, I got an alert. See, how long is this next one? Both of those stories do have a lot in common. Because, I recognize both of them, actually. I can't remember the names of them, but I've read stories like that before. But when you start reading a lot of fairy tales, you will see how many of them intertwine, basically. It's like a storyteller heard one story, forgot where he was, and then starts telling another story. Because I think there was a story about a prince and princess that had fallen in love, and the person wanting to keep them separate had a stream formed between them that they couldn't cross. And it wasn't until they found each other on the beach that they were able to get back together. Yeah, this is why I've got that index of fairy tale things and folklores on my throne wish list. That's one of the things that, Matsu and I have discussed just going through and sorting out all the stories before, just to see which ones actually line up with the other ones. It's a really interesting thought. It's the Fairy Tale and Folklore Index, or Motif Index. And it's just amazing how many times of the different stories I've read they will cross over each other like that. Looks like there's at least 10 different stories that work on the same basis as what we know as Cinderella. And it's always like gold and spindle and everything else. I mean, how would a hunt... Well, I guess he was a hunter for the king, so he might be able to afford a golden spindle wheel. But, let's see, it was a golden comb, a golden flute, and then a golden spinning wheel. Whereas other stories will be the other things are gold, but spinning was always all fur. There was a golden ring in the soup the first time, a golden spool in the second one, a golden spinning wheel in the third. It was actually in my second book. Yeah, it's just so many things are common in fairy tales, especially European fairy tales. I need to find more folklore books from different countries, just so I can get folklore from all the different countries, and just I want to compare them all. It would be interesting to actually get into creative folklore. None of the colleges around me would have it. But anyway, we still have half an hour till 11. So I'm going to get at least one more story read. And I've lost track of how many stories I've read. Let's see. One, two, three, four. Okay, this will be the fifth story for the night. Which is, I guess, good. So, our fifth story for this fantabulous Friday night of fairy tales. Which I know I have probably read several times before, because just the title of it seems very familiar. Because I just want to know about how you get out of that glass. Anyway, this one says it's Polish. The Glass Mountain. Once upon a time, there was a glass mountain, at the top of which stood a castle made of pure gold. And in front of the castle there grew an apple tree on which there were golden apples. Anyone who picked an apple gained admittance into the golden castle, and there in a silver room sat an enchanted princess of surpassing fairness and beauty. She was rich, too, as she was beautiful, for the cellars of the castle were full of precious stones, and great chests of the finest gold stood round the walls of all the rooms. Many knights had come from afar to try their luck, but it was in vain that they attempted to climb the mountain. In spite of having their horses shod with sharp nails, no one managed to get more than halfway up. And then they all fell right back down to the bottom of the steep, slippery hill. Sometimes a broken arm, sometimes a leg, and many a brave man had even broken his neck. The beautiful princess sat in her window and watched all the bold knights trying to reach her on their splendid horses. The sight of her always gave men fresh courage, and they flocked from 4 quarters of the globe to attempt the work of rescuing her. But all in vain. And for 7 years the princess had sat now and waited for someone to scale the glass mountain. Heaps of corpses, both of riders and horses, lay around the mountain, and many dying men lay groaning there, unable to go any further with their wounded limbs. And this is a children's story, supposedly. The whole neighborhood had the appearance of a vast graveyard. In 3 more days, the 7 years would be at an end, when a knight in golden armor and mounted on a spirited steed was seen making his way towards this fatal hill. Sticking his spurs into his horse, he made a rush at the mountain and got up halfway. And then he calmly turned his horse's head and came down again without a slip or a stumble. The following day he started in the same way. His horse trod on the glass as if it had been level earth, and sparks of fire flew from its hooves. All the other knights gazed in astonishment, for he had almost gained the summit. In another moment he would have reached the apple tree. But all of a sudden, a huge eagle rose up and spread its mighty wings, hitting as it did so the knight's horse in the eye. The beast shied, opened its wide nostrils, and tossed its mane. Then, rearing up high in the sky, its hind feet slipped, and it fell with its rider down the steep mountainside. Nothing was left of either of them except their bones, which rattled in the battered golden armor like dry peas in a pod. Wow. And now there was only 1 more day before the close of the 7 years. Then there arrived on the scene a mere schoolboy, a merry, happy-hearted youth, at the same time strong and well-grown. He saw how many knights had broken their necks in vain, and, undaunted, he approached the steep mountain on foot and began to ascend. For a long time, he had heard his parents speak of the beautiful princess who sat in the golden castle at the top of the glass mountain. He listened to all he heard and determined that he too would try his luck. But he first went to the forest, and he caught a lynx, and, cutting off the creature's sharp claws, he fastened them on his own hands and feet. Armed with these weapons, he boldly started up the glass mountain. The sun was nearly going down, and the youth had got no more than halfway up. He could hardly draw breath, he was so worn out, and his mouth was parched by thirst. A huge cloud passed over his head, but in vain did he beg and beseech her to let a drop of water fall on him. He opened his mouth, and the black cloud sailed past, and not as much of a drop of dew moistened his dry lips. His feet were torn and bleeding, and he could only hold on now with his hands. Evening closed in, and he strained his eyes to see if he could behold the top of the mountain. Then he gazed beneath him, and what a sight met his eyes! A yawning abyss with certain and terrible death at the bottom, reeking with half-decayed bodies of horses and their riders. And this had been the end of all the other brave men like himself who had attempted the ascent. It was almost pitch dark now, and only the stars lit up the glass mountain. The poor boy clung on as if glued to the glass by his blood-stained hands. He made no struggle to get higher, for all his strength had left him, and seeing no hope, he calmly awaited death. Then, all of a sudden, he fell into a deep sleep, and, forgetful of his dangerous position, he slumbered sweetly. But all the same, although he slept, he had stuck his sharp claws so firmly in the glass that he was quite safe not to fall. Now the golden apple tree was guarded by the eagle which had overthrown the golden knight and his horse. Every night it flew around the glass mountain, keeping a careful lookout, and no sooner had the moon emerged from the clouds than the bird rose up from the apple tree, and circling around the air, caught sight of the sleeping youth. Greedy for carrion and sure that this must be a fresh corpse, the bird swooped down upon the boy. But he was awake now, and perceiving the eagle, he determined by its help to save himself. The eagle dug its sharp claws into the tender flesh of the youth, but he bore the pain without a sound, and seized the bird's 2 feet with his hands. The creature in terror lifted him high up into the air and began to circle around the tower of the castle. The youth held on bravely. He saw the glimmering palace, by which the pale rays of the moon looked like a dim lamp, and he saw the high windows, and around one of them a balcony in which the beautiful princess sat lost in sad thoughts. Then the boy saw that he was close to the apple tree, and drawing a small knife from his belt, he cut off both the eagle's feet. The bird rose up in the air in its agony and vanished into the clouds, and the youth fell on the broad branches of the apple tree. Then he drew out the claws of the eagle's feet that had remained in his flesh, put the peel of one of the golden apples on his wound, and in one moment it was healed and well again. He pulled several of the beautiful apples and put them in his pockets, and then he entered the castle. The door was guarded by a great dragon, but as soon as he threw an apple at it, the beast vanished. At the same moment, a gate opened, and the youth perceived a courtyard full of flowers and beautiful trees, and on a balcony sat the lovely, enchanted princess with her retinue. As soon as she saw the youth, she ran towards him and greeted him as her husband and master. She gave him all her treasures, and the youth became as rich and a mighty ruler. But he never returned to the earth, for only the mighty eagle, who had been the guardian of the princess in the castle, could have carried on his wings the enormous treasure down to the world. But as the eagle had lost his feet, it died, and its body was found in a wood on the glass mountain. One day, when the youth was strolling about the palace garden with the princess, now his wife, he looked down over the edge of the glass mountain and saw, to his astonishment, a great number of people gathered there. He blew his silver whistle, and the swallow who acted as a messenger to the golden castle flew past. "Fly down and ask what the matter is," he said to the little bird, who sped off like lightning, and soon returned, saying,
"The blood of the eagle has restored all the people below to life. All those who have perished on the mountain are awakening up today, as if they were from a sleep. They are mounting their horses, and the whole population are gazing on this unheard of wonder with joy and amazement."
Okay. So, the boy is a change in the story. The Glass Mountain and the knights, all in golden armor, are common. Especially the knight in the golden armor riding halfway up and going, whatever, and riding back down without a problem. The story really changed when the knight died, and the boy was when he did it. that wasn't expected, which is a good thing. Which means the original storyteller was probably going through that and describing all of that, and then got to the point that, and the kids were probably going, I know, the Knight in the Golden Armor gets the princess, blah, 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 blah. And the storyteller decided to kill the knight. Because honestly, that kind of thing shows up in Dapplegrim. That one shows up in a few other ones. I mean, the palace made entirely of gold is one thing. Climbing up the mountain, the glass mountain, is another one. Which honestly, there are easier ways to climb glass mountains. Doing it on horseback and sharpening the horseshoes. Why? Sharp points aren't good for traction on glass. If you really wanted to do it, you'll use rubber soles. I mean, it's honestly, it probably wasn't the Lynx's claws that were doing it, it's the Lynx's pads. I mean, that would just make sense, right? Though, admittedly, spiders use their claws. Honestly, pads are there for a reason, folks. I mean, it's glass. You need something that would prevent... Oh, you want friction so you can climb glass. You don't use sharp points. That's just, you know, a given. Zeb Striker? I don't think that was Zeb Striker. Let's see. I'm going to look at the book to see how long this next story is. I might read it if it's short. Oh, Figgy. It's 8 pages. Oh no, they've got tar and they've got wagon wheels. I'm sure they could find a way to do it. I mean, even a horse's natural hooves, you could cause to have extra friction. I mean, either you could even texture leather to do it. That's alright, cool. I got it. I don't know what this abstract is. I have to look this up now. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, the abstract is just the evolved version. I've got the unevolved version before. I'm thinking maybe go ahead and rain out for the night. I'll try not to go over 11 o'clock. So, who is on that we might be able to read? I see Dusk is still doing her fundraising one. Well, I told Dusk I'd be back, so let me go ahead and switch over this one for at work.
Say your prayers.
I'll go ahead and read Dusk. She is doing the fundraising. So anything to help. So
the Sandman comes. Sleep with one eye open, gripping your pillow tight.
this raid messages are up. I hope you have a good night. I will probably go and watch your last stream on YouTube because I think you posted it there. I can't hear my music.
Something's wrong. Shut the lights. Heavy thoughts tonight, and they aren't Snow White.
Oh, I got myself muted. Duh.
Dreams of war, dreams of flyers, dreams of dragons, fire, and the things that
I don't hear it anyway.
sleep with one eye open, gripping your pillow tight.
That's weird.
Exit.
Anyway, it looks like the raid's gonna go on in 5 seconds. So
Take my hand.
yeah, it's supposed to be me narrating the song Enter Sandman. It's not sound very loud.
Now I lay me down to sleep. Pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I die before I wake, pray the Lord my soul to take. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. And never mind that noise you heard. It's just the beasts under your bed, in your closet,